She was born into a world that measured worth in dollars, diamonds, and dowries, and from the moment Consuelo Vanderbilt took her first breath in the marble halls of her family's Fifth Avenue mansion, her fate was already sealed, like a contract waiting for signatures. If you're drawn to the real stories behind gilded lies and broken crowns, hit subscribe. These are the women history tried to silence, but we won't. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted an heirloom, an asset, an alliance. And Consuelo, with her delicate features, her submissive smile, her breeding and her bloodline, was their golden ticket. The Gilded Age in America wasn't just about steel barons and robber kings. It was about power dressing itself in pearls, about mothers grooming daughters, not for love but for legacy. And in Alva Vanderbilt's eyes, Consuelo wasn't her child, she was her revenge. From the time she could walk, Consuelo was drilled in French and fencing. Her spine was trained straighter than a soldier's. Her diet was rationed, her books censored. Every word, every curtsy, every expression was curated like a showroom doll. Revenge against the old money elites who had looked down on the Vanderbilts for being new rich. Revenge against the social circles that had denied Alva entry. If they wouldn't open the gates willingly, she'd batter them down with a Duchess. Alva ruled their home like an empress. She humiliated Consuelo for slouching, slapped her for crying, locked her in rooms for hours if she disobeyed. The punishments weren't sipped parental. They were psychological warfare, all disguised as discipline. And behind closed doors, there was no softness. And the worst part, the world applauded. It wouldn't be some American banker or politician. No, it had to be bigger. Consuelo's beauty, the almond eyes, the swan-like neck, the tragic elegance, became her curse. Newspapers called her the most beautiful debutante in New York. Suitors lined up like bidders at an auction. But Alva had already made her decision. So Alva offered her daughter to the highest-ranking bidder, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Across the Atlantic in England, the aristocracy was bleeding money. Their mansions were crumbling, their estates suffocating under debt. What they needed was what America had: wealth. What America needed was what they had: titles. It had to be royal. The title was ancient. The man was cold. Alva needed a coronation. He needed money to save Blenheim Palace. And Consuelo, she wasn't set needed. She was used. She begged her mother not to force the match. She wept. She pleaded. She threatened to run. She loved another man, a quiet, kind American named Winthrop Rutherford. But love wasn't profitable. So Alva did what she always did. She broke her, and when that didn't work, she locked her in her room and took away all means of communication. Friends were barred, letters intercepted. When Consuelo refused to get engaged, Alva faked a life-threatening illness. She staged fainting spells. She manipulated the staff into whispering that Consuelo's disobedience might kill her mother. Alva told her, "You will marry the Duke, or you will destroy this family." And so, at 19, Consuelo walked down the aisle not to a life she chose, but to a sentence she could not escape. Her veil covered a face drained of color. Her bouquet trembled in her hands. It was blackmail, psychological, maternal, and absolute. But the cameras flashed anyway. Because America loved the fairy tale. Headlines screamed, "An American Duchess." Women cheered. Men nodded. Society congratulated itself on creating the perfect transatlantic merger. But no one asked the bride if she wanted it. She was meant to produce heirs, host dinners, smile for portraits. Her pain wasn't just invisible, it was expected. Blenheim Palace was everything Consuelo feared, cold, vast, and crawling with servants who spoke in coded glances. The Duke, her new husband, treated her like property. Their wedding night wasn't a moment, it was a transaction. And in the weeks that followed, he rarely spoke to her unless there were guests to impress. And yet, somewhere inside her, the girl who had once tried to run away was still alive. She decorated her quarters, not with gold but with books. She read obsessively, widely, dangerously, philosophy, feminism, revolution. She kept journals, wrote poetry. She looked at herself in the mirror and tried to remember who she was before the crown. And she began to see the cracks in the empire that had swallowed her whole. She began to resist in silence. Her husband wasn't stit noble. He was trapped. And she wasn't stit alone. The aristocracy wasn't powerful, it was decaying. And when she gave birth to 2 sons, the heirs her husband demanded, she didn't see it as surrender. She started attending reform meetings. She donated anonymously at first to women's shelters. She wrote letters to Winthrop, to herself, to the girl she used to be. Servants whispered about their own dreams. Local women taught her how to move unseen. And slowly over months, Consuelo began to carve a secret life beneath the corsets and titles. Because now she had leverage. She saw it as strategy. The court couldn't touch her, not without risking the succession. So she used her new position not to rise higher, but to walk away. Consuelo started spending less time at Blenheim, more in London, then Paris, then everywhere her husband wasn't. Rumors spread that she laughed in public, that the Duchess had a mind of her own, that she dined with radicals, that she smiled without permission. And one day, without warning, Consuelo filed for separation. Alva, across the ocean, was furious, but powerless. A duchess leaving a duke? A Vanderbilt rejecting royalty? It was a scandal. But Consuelo didn't take care. She was a woman walking out of the auction house. She was no longer a girl begging not to be sold. And the world, stunned, titillated, breathless, could do nothing but watch. And it was just beginning. Because this time, the bride was writing her own story. They called it scandal. But for Consuelo, it was salvation. When she filed for legal separation from the Duke of Marlborough, it wasn't just a rebellion, it was treason in the eyes of the empire. Aristocratic women didn't leave their husbands. They endured, they withered behind lace curtains. They cried into handkerchiefs embroidered with the family crest. But they didn't leave. The papers swirled with gossip. American Duchess breaks royal code. Vanderbilt heiress defies crown. But she didn't respond. Not with interviews, not with statements. She simply vanished, slipping through the smoke of high society like she always had. Unless they had already died once and clawed their way back from the gilded grave. Unless they were her. She took a modest apartment in London, far from the chandeliers and powdered faces of Blenheim Palace. She no longer woke to the sound of maids arranging her gowns, no more forced breakfasts with a man who saw her as an investment, no more pretending. And yet her freedom came at a cost. And in the shadows, she started living. She couldn't see her sons as often. The Duke, still furious at her defiance, used custody as a weapon. Her name was whispered in elite drawing rooms as if it carried disease. Women who once curtsied at her presence now offered polite nods and looked away. But Consuelo didn't just flinch, because for the first time in her life, she was the one choosing the silence. And in that silence, she rebuilt herself. She began to write, not just letters, but essays, speeches, diaries full of thoughts she'd never dared speak. She met other women, artists, suffragists, social reformers, not out of pity or duty, but because they reminded her of who she could be. One woman in particular changed everything. Her name was Winnaretta Singer, heiress to the Singer sewing machine empire, and an unapologetically queer, fiercely intellectual patroness of the arts. Winnaretta took Consuelo under her wing, not as a cause, but as an equal. Together they discussed women's rights, poverty, public housing, education, real things, big things. She traveled through Europe, not in carriages of gold, but in carriages of purpose, visiting orphanages, sitting in classrooms with children who had never seen a duchess, let alone one who listened. She gave lectures, attended rallies, donated anonymously to suffragette causes. And suddenly, Consuelo's world, once made of gowns and marriages, burst open like a locked door. But even as she built this new world, ghosts followed her. Her mother, Alva, who once ruled her life like a tyrant, had now rebranded herself as a feminist. Alva hosted women's rights conventions in America, gave speeches, donned a sash of progress. It was ironic. The woman who once locked her daughter in a room to force a marriage now marched for liberation. And yet, when Consuelo looked at her mother's face, she didn't see hypocrisy. She saw hunger, the same hunger that had shaped everything: to be respected, to be remembered. And for the first time, she understood her, because she wanted the same thing, just not through domination, but through defiance. One cold winter in Paris, Consuelo stood before a room full of women. Many had no titles, no wealth, no safety nets, just stories like hers, sold, shaped, silenced. She didn't read from notes. She didn't wear a tiara. Then thundered with applause. She said, "I was raised to be a symbol. I was married to become a statue. But I broke, quietly, until only my bones were left. And I rebuilt myself, not as a duchess, but as a person." The room went silent. She had never felt more seen. Still, the aristocracy didn't forget. The Duke continued to punish her in court, used the children as bargaining chips, spread whispers that she was unstable, undignified, dangerous. But the truth was, she was becoming dangerous. And then he made a mistake. To a system that had never been challenged, to a narrative that had only allowed women to suffer gracefully, not speak boldly. The Duke remarried. His new wife wasn't a Vanderbilt, not even close. She brought no money, no fame, only her compliance. Suddenly society saw the pattern. It hadn't been Consuelo who failed the marriage. Over the next few years, public opinion began to shift. Her story, once told in whispers, became a cautionary tale of a woman who had obeyed too well, too long, and paid the price. It had been the marriage that failed her. She leaned into that image, used it. By the time she finalized her divorce, the world had changed. Women had taken to the streets. Suffrage was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. She began advocating for women's legal rights in marriage, property laws, custody battles, the things no duchess had ever dared touch. And all the while, her sons, now older, began to see her not as the woman who left, but as the woman who survived. And Consuelo. She was in the crowd, not at the front, not behind, just moving, with purpose, with people, with fire in her eyes. And then, something no one expected. She fell in love again. Not with a duke or a noble, but with a French aviator and diplomat named Jacques Bolsard. He wanted her as a partner. He was kind, intelligent, modern. He loved her mind. He respected her independence. He didn't want her as a trophy. And for the first time in her life, Consuelo chose a marriage. Just a quiet promise between two people who had lived enough to know that love was not a crown, but a refuge. She married Jacques in a private ceremony. No carriages, no cameras, no newspaper spreads. Together they built a life in France, modest by aristocratic standards, rich by every other. She continued her humanitarian work, wrote her memoirs, held salons where women could speak freely without fear of correction or control. And though the world still called her Duchess, she had long since shed that skin. She was a mother, a writer, a survivor, a symbol, not of gilded wealth, but of earned wisdom. And behind the lace curtains, in the quiet of her study, she would sometimes glance at the photographs of Blenheim Palace and smile, not in bitterness, not even in triumph. She had walked out of the fire, but in relief. She learned quickly that love was not part of the bargain, and lived. The Duke of Marlborough's palace was vast, cold, and filled with the kind of silence that made young brides disappear. Blenheim wasn't a home, it was a fortress of tradition, rules and eyes that never blinked. Servants whispered in hallways, Nobles sneered in parlors, and Consuelo, she smiled when spoken to, curtsied when expected, and obeyed like she had been trained to do since childhood. And soon she would give him both. But inside, something stirred. She had crossed the ocean as an American heiress and arrived as a duchess, but no crown could dull the ache in her chest when the Duke looked at her like she was an investment. On their wedding night, he didn't kiss her. He didn't even sit near her. He made it clear. He didn't want her. He wanted the money, the title, the heir. She stood in the nursery, cradling the child, and felt nothing but a hollow victory. The room smelled of milk and lavender. Outside, guests drank champagne. But she couldn't shake the thought that she was just a vessel, chosen, used, and now unnecessary. Their first child, a boy, came with fanfare. Newspapers called it a triumph. Her mother called it duty fulfilled. The Duke called it acceptable. Consuelo called it numb. The second child came with less joy. Another boy, another obligation checked off the list. And then the visits to her room stopped entirely. She became ornamental, wheeled out for dinners, posed for portraits, locked away when not needed. The society pages raved about her beauty, her grace, her perfect posture, but none of them saw the woman pacing behind the curtains at night, whispering her name to herself just to remember it. And yet she played the role, for a time. She stood beside the Duke at public events, draped in jewels she never asked for, wrapped in gowns that felt like chains. She smiled. She nodded. She survived. But survival has a strange cost. It slowly convinces you that endurance is the same as living. Consuelo, not Duchess, not mother, not heir producer, just Consuelo. Until one day something cracks. It started with a letter. Not from her husband, not from her mother, from a friend. A real one. A woman who had known her before the palaces, before the titles, before the silence. The letter spoke of a gathering in Paris, a salon filled with writers, artists, thinkers, people who believed women could be more than decorations. In that smoky room, surrounded by voices that challenged the world, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: heat. Not from the fireplace, but from within, a warmth she had buried so deep she forgot it had a name. Her opinions. Consuelo read it 3 times. Then, without permission, she went. She had them, still, and they mattered. She returned to England, a little straighter, a little quieter, but the silence now was intentional, focused, watching. She began to read more. Philosophy, politics, feminist essays. She wrote letters to women trapped in their own gilded cages. She spoke, cautiously at first, at charity events, but her words were sharp, unapologetic. The Duke disapproved. Her mother warned her. Society rolled its eyes. But she no longer cared. The palace began to feel smaller, not because it changed, but because she was outgrowing it. The rooms no longer intimidated her. The stairs no longer shamed her. She knew now if she stayed, she would rot. The Duke tried to stop her, threatened scandal, accused her of madness. So she made a choice that no Vanderbilt, no Duchess, no good society woman was supposed to make. She left. She smiled. Let them talk. She walked out with nothing but a name she finally chose for herself, not Marlborough, not Vanderbilt, just Consuelo. She moved to Paris, bought a small apartment, lived simply, wrote fiercely. She spoke about forced marriages, about wealth used as a leash, about mothers who turned daughters into pawns, about palaces that felt like prisons. Women listened, and the world shifted, just a little. And it was there, in the city of thinkers and rebels, that she found her voice, not the whisper she had carried for years, but the roar she had been holding back her entire life. Her memoir came next. She didn't burn kingdoms. She didn't lead revolutions, but she lit a candle in a place that had been dark for centuries. A book that peeled back the velvet curtain and showed the bruises beneath. People gasped. Nobles sneered. Her mother refused to read it. But young women, they devoured it. They saw their reflections in her story, in the quiet suffocation, in the polished cages, in the smiling photographs that masked despair. Consuelo didn't ask for pity. She asked for something far more dangerous. She was no longer just the American Duchess, no longer the woman with the swan neck and tragic eyes. She became a symbol of rebellion, of reclamation, truth, and she gave it, line by line, chapter by chapter, until her portrait in the public eye changed. Because she proved something terrifyingly powerful, that a woman can be sold and still buy herself back. And that terrified the very world that once owned her. That a crown can be worn and still cast off. That even in a world built to control her, she could walk away, fully, fiercely, finally. They called her selfish, and for the first time in her life she believed it. She called it survival. Paris didn't make her forget who she was. It reminded her of who she could be. There were no velvet carpets, no golden gates, just narrow streets where women spoke their minds without apology and didn't lower their eyes when men entered the room. The salons pulsed with philosophy, revolution, poetry, and rage. And in the corner of it all sat Consuelo, quiet at first, then sharper with each evening, like a blade finding its edge again after years of dust. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was an idea, the Duchess who left the palace, the Vanderbilt who turned her back on the empire. Whispers surrounded her like smoke, some admiring, others scandalized, but none dared deny her presence now. And with presence came purpose. The press tried to repackage her, of course. Duchess turned activist. She began organizing events, not for royalty, but for real women, widows, teachers, factory workers, those crushed under the same weight she once bore, only without the luxury to run. She stood before them not as a savior, but as proof that escape was possible. That silence wasn't noble. That dignity didn't require a tiara. From palace to podium, they still clung to the crown, afraid to let her exist without it. But she refused to play their game. In speeches, she rarely mentioned her title. Instead, she spoke about prisons with silk bars, about beauty used as a muzzle, about obedience taught like scripture. She told stories that never made the society pages, the ones about bruised wrists hidden under lace, or young girls who said yes because the word no had been trained out of them. Women who had once envied her began to understand her. And as she spoke, something strange began to happen. Because pain doesn't care about class. The Duchess had been locked in a palace. They'd been locked in kitchens, schools, marriages. But the cage was the same. She traveled across Europe now, invited not to gala dinners, but to women's conferences. She wore tailored coats instead of ball gowns, carried books instead of gloves. She no longer entered rooms to be looked at. She entered to be heard. But the shadows of her past still followed. She didn't respond. Letters from her mother arrived, laced with disappointment, requests to cease embarrassing the family, to return to tradition, to remember her role. The Duke sent a formal request through lawyers, an attempt to silence parts of her memoir before publication. He claimed it threatened his honor. Consuelo laughed. He had spent their marriage treating her like an acquisition. Now he feared exposure like a child fears the dark. But this time she held the candle. When the memoir released, it shattered illusions like crystal falling from a banquet table. There were no vulgar stories, no scandalous affairs, just truth. Quiet, precise, devastating truth. About forced vows, about the ache of motherhood under duress, about the numbness of sleeping beside someone who views you as a ledger line. Readers wept, critics praised, aristocrats fumed. And in the aftermath of that clarity, something even more radical emerged. It was clarity, but it wasn't state fame she wanted. For not fighting sooner, for bowing too long, for smiling too wide when her heart was breaking. She forgave herself. She no longer wore black out of mourning, but out of choice. It became her armor, sleek, minimal, free from expectations. She walked freely through cities now, rarely recognized. The portraits of the Duchess were still hanging in British drawing rooms, but they were lies. She had shed that woman like dead skin. In Italy, she found peace in the hills of Florence. She rented a villa with cracked walls and wild ivy, far from courts and cameras. There, she began writing letters again, not to the powerful, but to girls. Hundreds of them. They poured in from around the world, scrawled in crooked handwriting and folded into thin envelopes. They told her of weddings they didn't want, fathers who silenced them, dreams left under beds, and Consuelo replied to every single one. Her handwriting, once trained to be ornamental, had softened into something human. Leave if you must. You are not selfish for wanting more. You do not belong to anyone who does not listen to your voice. She signed them simply C, and her legend grew, not the kind sculpted by stone but by breath, quietly passed from one woman to another like a secret worth keeping. She never remarried. She began supporting girls' schools in rural towns, funded scholarships, traveled in secret to visit orphanages that reminded her of her son's cold nurseries. There were suitors, of course, men intrigued by the myth, by the fire beneath the lace, but she had spent too long being claimed. Now she belonged only to herself. Sometimes at night, she would walk the gardens of the villa and think of the girl she used to be, the one gripping the church pew in that wedding gown, eyes full of dread and spine made of glass. That girl had survived, had spoken, had broken centuries of silence with nothing more than a whisper that refused to die. She smiled at the thought. Then, as always, she returned to her desk, lit a candle and wrote, because in a world that had always told her to be seen but not heard, she had chosen her voice, and she would use it until the end. The woman they once called her Grace now walked barefoot on stone floors, scribbled edits with ink-stained fingers, and laughed with strangers who didn't know her past. And that, more than anything, was her quiet victory. She had once been a symbol of perfection. Now she was a living contradiction, a duchess without a crown, a Vanderbilt who didn't flaunt her fortune, a woman who had tasted the coldness of palaces and found warmth in purpose. Because the world had spent years building a castle around Consuelo Vanderbilt, a gilded trap of etiquette, titles and obligations, but she had burned the blueprints. Every bow she refused, every banquet she skipped, every truth she told in defiance of a royal lie, it chipped away at the fortress. But the past didn't let go so easily. The heir to the Blenheim legacy, the boy born not of love, but of duty, raised by nannies, polished by tutors, shaped to rule, not to feel. And now he was entering the same contract she had once been shackled by. Her son was getting married. It crept back one morning in the form of a telegram. Consuelo stared at the telegram for hours. She wrote no reply. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. But something deep within her ached, a quiet breaking like frost snapping in sunlight. Instead, she lit a candle, opened a worn journal and wrote, "History repeats itself until someone breaks it." She would not attend the wedding. She would not vanish quietly. But in that silence, she made another decision. And when the gossip columns tried to shame her absence, she said nothing. Let them guess. Let them fabricate. She had learned the power of silence. It bruised more than rebuttals. Not anymore. Consuelo returned to Paris, not as a recluse, but as a force. She launched a foundation, discreet at first, focused on women's education, then health clinics, then legal aid. The name Vanderbilt opened doors she used, not for prestige, but for purpose. She refused public recognition. No statues, no titles, just results. But the ripple grew. Now she was buying freedom for others. Women who once whispered in corners now spoke on stages. Laws began to shift, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. And at the center of that tremor stood the woman who had once been sold into a marriage contract like property. One night in a cafe tucked near the Seine, a young journalist approached her. "Do you regret it?" the girl asked, leaving it all behind. Consuelo didn't answer at first. She sipped her tea, then looked out the window, where the gas lamps flickered like stars too tired to shine. "I regret not leaving sooner," she finally said, "but never that I left." It appeared in pamphlets, feminist newspapers, college lectures. Young women began quoting her not as a duchess, but as a blueprint for rebellion. The quote spread like wildfire. She had become a myth again, but on her own terms. And then, just when the world thought she had said all she needed to, she released something unexpected, a second memoir. This time, there were no veils of politeness, no polite omissions. She wrote of how her body was used like currency, how her mind was dulled with banquets and protocols, how every glance from a nobleman felt like inventory, how she had learned to perform joy, to bow with grace even when she wanted to scream. It was sharp. The backlash was immediate. She recounted private conversations with monarchs who mocked the suffrage movement, with matriarchs who sold their daughters for status, with bishops who blessed marriages that felt more like burials. She named names. One by one, the chains fell. She was beyond reach now. No court could strip her of a title she no longer claimed. No scandal could stain a woman who had already confessed her sins, real or imagined, and walked out free. But it didn't matter. It wasn't set about marches or riots. And in their place, a movement grew. They called it the Silent Rebellion. It was about women quitting jobs that belittled them, leaving marriages that bruised them, writing truths they were told to bury. And in letters, speeches, poems, they thanked her, not for leading them, but for showing them that survival was possible. By the time she turned 60, the press had changed their tone. She became a lighthouse. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. But those labels too felt like boxes. Now it was visionary, pioneer, mother of resistance. No longer disgraced duchess. Consuelo spent her final years in a modest villa in southern France. Her staff was small, her meals simple, her walls lined with books and old letters tied in ribbon. She rarely gave interviews, but when she did, she always began the same way. That line haunted everyone who heard it. "Before I was a duchess, I was a girl who said yes because no one taught her she could say no." And then, quietly as always, she began to fade. Because it was true not just for her, but for millions. No grand finale, no farewell speech. Just quieter walks, slower mornings, a long sigh that never ended. She had written a single sentence. One morning, her assistant found her by the window, eyes closed, journal in lap, pen still in hand. No tiara, no velvet gown, just her favorite writing shawl and a copy of her memoir placed beside her heart. "If my story made you feel less alone, then I lived well." They buried her without spectacle, just as she had asked. In schoolbooks rewritten with her name in bold. In whispers passed between mothers and daughters. And yet, she was everywhere. In mirrors where women no longer apologized for what they saw. They had tried to make her a symbol. But she had become something more dangerous. A memory that refused to behave. But inside her, something was shifting. The summer estates no longer held their charm. Marble columns and cascading fountains couldn't wash away the truth. Consuelo now carried like a second skin. She was a duchess in name, a prisoner in silk, and the world still applauded, blind to the bars they helped build. She no longer waited for her mother's voice to dictate her thoughts. She no longer tilted her head for approval. And when Charles entered the room, she didn't flinch. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had lost its grip. It had become something else now. Cold, hard, directional. It didn't happen all at once. No single moment lit the match. It was a slow burn, a letter unopened, a glance avoided, a mirror passed without looking, the kind of change that starts in silence and ends in rebellion. She would outlast him. And soon she found her cause, and she did. It began with the villagers, women who lined the roads for hours just to glimpse her carriage. They didn't see a duchess. They saw a woman who had once been one of them, a woman who could still speak to them if she chose to. She visited the sick, funded hospitals, sat by the bedsides of women who had been forgotten by the very class she was forced into. She didn't bring jewels or speeches. She brought ears, and when she listened, something inside her healed. The pain made sense now. It had to mean something. It had to build something. So she began to write. Not poetry, not diaries, but checks, declarations, demands. She funded midwifery programs, championed maternal health, spoke at rallies behind closed doors and later in halls too large to ignore. The woman who once sat silent beside a future king now stood before crowds, speaking without apology. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was clear, and it was hers. Charles hated it. Every appearance she made, every article that quoted her name, chipped away at the illusion he'd crafted, that he was the center, and she the ornament. Now she was something dangerous, visible. But he couldn't stop her. Not anymore. Even Queen Victoria, once so cold to the American interloper, took notice. The Dowager monarch saw in Consuelo a version of power she could respect, quiet, consistent, and unfazed by disapproval. Yet in the house she called home, the war was far from over. Charles retaliated in the only way he knew, through control. He cut allowances, questioned her every move, reprimanded her in front of staff. But the more he tightened, the more she slipped through his fingers. She no longer cried behind locked doors. She no longer asked for affection, and she no longer begged for permission. Then came the affair. Not hers. It wasn't new. His indiscretions had long been whispered in drawing rooms and scribbled into society columns. But this one was different. His. It was public. She withdrew. And Consuelo, for the first time, didn't pretend it hadn't happened. She didn't cover for him. She didn't pose for photographs to smooth over the scandal. Not in shame. Let them see who he really was. Let them see what marriage looked like when one party played the role and the other rewrote the script. In strategy, the press shifted. That sympathy became leverage. No longer was she the pampered duchess in Versailles gowns. She was the woman who stayed while he strayed, the loyal wife, the sympathetic figure, a pawn perhaps, but one that the audience began rooting for. She used it to expand her charitable work, to fund suffragist campaigns discreetly, to form alliances with women who would one day reshape history. And still, her mother remained silent. Alva didn't defend her, didn't denounce Charles. She watched from afar, her silence saying everything and nothing all at once. Perhaps she couldn't face what she had created. Perhaps she still believed this was better than a life without titles. But Consuelo no longer needed her mother Sip's voice. She had her own now, and with it she planned her escape. It wouldn't be dramatic, it wouldn't be loud, but it would be final. She began consulting lawyers in secret, reading about annulment law, gathering documentation, preparing witnesses. It was not easy. The church did not look kindly upon divorce, especially not from dukes. But she wasn't trying to impress the church. She was trying to survive. The final straw came on a winter morning, unremarkable in every way except what it revealed. A letter, addressed to Charles, from a woman whose name Consuelo recognized only too well. The tone was intimate, the language explicit. It was not the first, and would not be the last. He read it, said nothing. She placed it on his desk, said nothing. And in that silence they both understood. What followed was a negotiation, not of love, not of custody, but of image. It was over. They would not humiliate each other in public. Not yet. They would not shame the Vanderbilt name or the Marlborough title, but they would separate, quietly, strategically. Not immediately. The papers would take years, the church even longer, but the decision was made. She had stepped into the fire and walked out carrying the match, and she would be free. When she left Blenheim Palace for the last time, she didn't cry. She didn't look back. She boarded the train with only a single bag and a book of poetry in her hands. Outside, the snow began to fall. Inside, she exhaled, not in grief, but in something dangerously close to joy. She had finally chosen herself. And the world, the same world that once auctioned her like a prize, would now witness something even rarer, a Duchess unbecoming. She chose a modest apartment near the Seine, not too grand, not too hidden. A place with windows that opened wide and floors that creaked under honest footsteps. She filled it with books, fresh-cut flowers, and the kind of silence that wasn't lonely, only earned. For the first time in decades, she could breathe without bracing. She settled into Paris, like a woman slipping back into her own skin. No guards, no titles echoing through marble halls, no reminders of who she was expected to be. Just Consuelo, not Duchess, not pawn, walking unfamiliar boulevards, free in a way that still startled her when she caught her reflection in a passing shop window. The newspapers called it scandalous. The runaway Duchess, they wrote. The American girl who dared leave a palace. But the headlines didn't touch her. She was done being the girl in their fairy tales, done pretending the crown had fit. And in that time she grew. She wrote letters to her sons, long ones, honest ones, not to explain herself, but to tell them who she really was, not the woman Charles had described, but the woman they could still come to know. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for time. And in that newfound silence, something extraordinary happened. She learned to say no, not just to others, but to herself. No to guilt, no to performing, no to the quiet voice that still tried to whisper that she was being selfish. People started listening. Not to the Duchess, to the woman. She was invited to speak, at salons, then charities, then international women's conferences. At first, she hesitated. She had spent so long being told to smile and stay still. But once she opened her mouth, the words came easily. Not because she had rehearsed them, but because they had been waiting inside her for years. She spoke of women's health, of autonomy, of class, of the invisible prisons built by wealth and tradition, and when she spoke, rooms full of powerful men went quiet. Now, she was the voice. She had once been the prize. Her name began to reappear, not in the society pages but in political circles, in whispers between suffragists, in telegrams between organizers. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. She formed committees, funded midwife programs across Europe, advocated for the education of girls in slums and rural towns. She didn't just donate. She showed up, with her sleeves rolled, her voice steady. But the past, like dust, has a way of settling back onto even the cleanest floors. Charles sent word, through lawyers, through third parties. Then, eventually, in a letter she read 3 times before burning, he wanted her back, for optics. Not for love, not even for legacy. She didn't reply. His political ambitions were wilting, and the absence of his Duchess was making donors nervous. The American heiress was no longer the sweet ornament they had hoped for, but her story had become magnetic, and Charles, in his usual cold precision, wanted to harness it. She didn't have to. "I was sold once," she said, "but I did not stay bought." The world was already watching, but this time they were watching her. In Geneva, she gave her first public speech in French. Nervous, her hands trembling at the podium, she began not with grandeur but a truth no one expected. The room went still, applause so loud it drowned the memory of every debutante curtsy she'd ever been forced to perform. And then they rose. That night she walked home alone, her scarf pulled tight, her heels echoing on cobblestones. She passed a man reading the paper, her name bold on the front page. And yet there was one corner of her life still unfinished. But for once, it didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. Alva, her mother, the woman who had raised her, pushed her, packaged her, then vanished when the machine began to crumble. Consuelo hadn't written in years. She didn't know if her mother would respond, but she sent a letter anyway. Short, clear. I left, not to shame you, but to find what I was before you named me. Then a cable. Weeks passed, no reply. One line. You found it. I see her now. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. No tiaras, but it was enough. And so, when the Vatican finally granted the annulment, a rarity for royals, a miracle for commoners, she did not throw a party. She didn't even tell the press. She spent that evening with two friends, sipping tea and reading aloud from a worn copy of Austen. No portraits, just laughter that didn't need permission. The Duchess of Marlborough no longer existed. And the woman who had been sold at 16, displayed like an ornament, used like a tool, now stood on the other side of the glass, unframed and whole. She hadn't escaped unscarred. Consuelo Vanderbilt did. But she had escaped. And that, in the world she came from, was nothing short of a revolution. The walls of Blenheim Palace had never known silence like this before, not in all their years of housing war generals and dukes and diplomatic ghosts. But now, in this moment, silence reigned, not peaceful, not resigned, but powerful. It was the kind of silence that comes not when a war ends, but when a woman finally stops asking for permission. The guests were gone. The servants pretended not to notice the shift in the air. The Duke, wherever he was, remained locked in the echo chamber of his own importance. But the house felt different now, as if for the first time it belonged to her, or perhaps no longer belonged to anyone. Years had passed since that first wedding portrait, the one where she smiled with her mouth and not her eyes, since the headlines proclaimed her the American girl who won the most eligible bachelor in Britain. They'd never bothered to ask what she'd lost. She'd lost her name, her language, her right to breathe without approval. But what she never lost, not entirely, was the quiet fire beneath the surface. The one her mother had tried to smother with bridal fabrics. The one the Duke had tried to freeze with duty. It had flickered, dimmed, retreated into the corners of drawing rooms and behind locked doors. And now it burned. It began with the letters, quiet ones at first, sent in secret to suffragettes, to women's societies, to causes that asked not for applause, but for revolution in silk gloves. Her name carried weight, and she began to lend it, carefully, strategically, to the women no one else would listen to. She didn't make speeches, not yet, but she made space, money, shelter, opportunity. And she listened.